Hey, everybody, this is Chris, and I'm here to talk with you today about outcomes somewhat generally, but in more specific terms towards the second half of the talk, patient-reported outcomes. This is a part of my research program that used to consume almost three-quarters of all that I did. And we're now in a very good place in pediatrics where we have a pretty broad toolkit for measuring both clinical and patient-reported outcomes. And so what I wanted to do today, slow down, is to share with you some of my thinking about how to assess outcomes, but then really build out the patient-reported outcome piece of that. And then Carol Tucker will talk with you about some of her experiences applying patient-reported outcomes in clinical settings. Patient-reported outcomes are part of just about every PCORI study. They're part of almost all clinical trials now, and they're being embedded into electronic health records for quality improvement and also for monitoring of patients' individual clinical status. So they're the newest member of the clinical toolkit, and I hope by the end of today's presentation, you have a better feel for what they are and how to use them. So let's dive into this. Specifically, we're going to address some of the specific considerations about pediatric outcome assessment. I'll talk about PROMIS. This is the patient-reported outcome measurement information system that was launched by the National Institutes of Health. It's really become the dominant set of tools and also approaches for assessing patient-reported outcomes in the United States. Excuse me. I'll provide the conceptual basis of that and a bit about computerized adaptive testing, and then show you some examples from our own research. So let's start with children and patient-reported outcomes. In learning health system science, we're often asking questions around the effects of interventions. And what we want to know is, what are those effects of interventions, but as well environmental challenges, such as the juvenile justice system, or diseases such as chronic illness, on clinical outcomes and patients' lived experiences. The lived experience concept is essentially the notion that people are in constant and dynamic interaction with their environments, that there's a lived experience of those interactions. And in order to understand the lived experience, you have to talk to people. You have to get the information directly from them. You have to understand how they perceive their lives, how they feel through symptoms, what they do in life, their functioning, and their overall evaluations. And so sometimes we use the phrase lived experiences to refer to the process by which outcomes from the patient's perspective are derived. Other times we might just use the heuristic patient-reported outcomes. Here's a slide that, in a very high level, shows the domains of outcome for children's health. When we talk about outcomes, I really believe at the individual level, forget the system level for at least this talk, I really believe that we are addressing issues related to people's health and well-being. Satisfaction with care is a process measure. Costs is a system outcome. What we want to know is, how do health interventions, diseases themselves, environmental influences affect health status? So you can organize outcomes into these categories, where the black outcome domain referred to clinical outcomes, and then the purple outcome domains refer to lived experiences. So survival disorders, and disorders can be broken down into a number of subcategories. You can think of disorders as complications or adverse events or adverse drug reactions. Comorbidities, these are conditions that co-occur with an index condition. Morbidity burden, this is the totality of morbidity experienced by a patient. And severity, which refers to the stability of a condition over time. Sometimes people will add to body functioning, the next line, the kinds of functions that you may be familiar with. These are biologic functions, but the concept of physiological stability is often used in clinical assessment. This refers, for example, in ICU care, to assessing organ systems functioning to get an overall sense of physiological stability. Growth is another clinical outcome. And then as you begin to move into lived experiences, you get into things like what Amartya Sen called doing, the ability of people to do things that they find valuable, their functioning, their ability to be mobile, their ability to think, their ability to feel, etc. You can divide functioning into both capacities, that's the ability to do something, as well as actual performance. So sometimes that's called the realized doings. If you look at the International Classification of Functioning, which is the companion World Health Organization compendium to the International Classification of Diseases, if ICD classifies as diseases, ICF classifies functioning. You will see in that classification this concept and distinction of functioning into both capacities, which is the ability to do something, as well as performance, actually doing those things. Furthermore, additional domains include symptoms, both emotionally experienced symptoms, such as emotional distress, anxiety, depressive symptoms, anger, as well as physical symptoms, things like pain, fatigue, and also the broader concept of suffering. Now, the notion of suffering really refers to the negative distress that people feel. And sometimes that's part of subjective well-being, that last category. Ed Diener's tripartite model of subjective well-being has a negative affect as one of the components, and then positive affect as a second component, and evaluative well-being or life satisfaction as a third component. Today, most people would distinguish subjective well-being into three dimensions: the hedonic dimension, feelings of happiness, this is positive emotions; an evaluative dimension, having the sense of having a satisfying life, both overall as well as the specific components of your life, such as being satisfied with your relationships, being satisfied with your living conditions, etc. And then a third component, what sometimes is called the eudaimonic component, that's an Aristotelian term, overall life purpose, finding meaning in life, hopefulness, and optimism. So across these 8 domains, you have a wide variety of outcomes that you can assess. I'll touch a bit on the clinical outcomes, not in a lot of detail, just to give you some examples of work that we've been doing. And then I'll dive more deeply into the lived experiences. We published a paper a couple of years ago that actually, I think now is the second most cited paper in Health Affairs. It was the most cited paper in 2018 on children's mortality. What we did is compared mortality rate of children in the United States, which is the red line on these charts, with mortality in 19 OECD countries. These are so-called developed nations or high-income nations, European nations, Australia, New Zealand, etc. We contrasted mortality rates between these two groups from 1960 to 2010 in the 50-year period. And what you see here is on the left, mortality rates for infants. You can see that for up until about 1975, the infant mortality rate was quite similar between the US and the OECD 19, but then it began to diverge at about 1975. And for older, for kids 1 to 19, older kids, we saw a significant divergence dating back all the way to the 1960s. There is a big gap between the likelihood of death in the United States versus OECD nations. We have similar economic development, but we don't have similar life chances. Children in the United States have an 82 times, I'll say that again, an 82 times greater likelihood of dying by firearm than children in the OECD nations. Other explanations for this gap are prematurity, higher rates of prematurity in the United States, as well as higher rates of motor vehicle accidents. So this is an example of using the mortality or survival outcome domain to generate information that can be useful for setting policies. And the policies here that this sort of generated discussion about included policies related to prematurity, motor vehicle accidents, and firearm safety. We did a study in PEDSnet, and PEDSnet was a key leader in this, to evaluate the alternative bariatric surgeries that are done in adolescents. There's a study that was done for all ages, and PEDSnet led the activity on adolescents. So there are three different types of surgery: sleeve gastrectomy, gastric bypass, and gastric banding. Here, what you're seeing for adolescents is the proportion of all cases that were assigned to one of these three categories. And by 2011, sleeve gastrectomy accounted for the majority, actually for most of the bariatric surgeries. But what are the differences in outcome? There had never been a study of nearly 1,000 adolescents up until this point. And here, what you're looking at on the y-axis is the change in BMI, the percent change in BMI following surgery. And the upper lines are essentially gastric banding, and we kind of it kind of falls off after 16 months of follow-up, because not only did the sample sizes become small, which is the main reason why we're not showing it on the slide, but it actually began to be done much less frequently after a few years, because it was just failing in adolescents. Sleeve gastrectomy and Roux-en-Y shows very similar change in BMI, with many fewer adverse events associated with sleeve gastrectomy. So this provided support for sleeve gastrectomy when bariatric surgery was being done for adolescents. So this is an example of a study that was done in PEDSnet, informed clinical decision-making. It used a clinical outcome here of body mass index, a measure of adiposity, a measure of growth, focusing on that domain. So that's all I'm going to say about clinical outcomes. This is a talk really focusing on the lived experiences of patients and their patient-reported outcomes. So we're not going to dive into functioning, symptoms, and well-being. According to the FDA, a person-reported outcome, and we use the word person to note that not everybody who completes these measures is a patient. They may be individuals who are evaluated from schools or other service settings that are outside the healthcare, outside of the healthcare setting. A patient-reported outcome or a person-reported outcome is an individual's assessment. That means from the person themselves, an individual's assessment of their health or well-being that comes directly from them without interpretation at all by a clinician or anyone else. So you are not probing, you're essentially delivering a standardized question, standardized item, and then you're receiving the response without any kind of discussion or interpretation. I like to put this into plain English language. That's kind of the academic definition. You might say a child-reported outcome includes reports of how children feel, or what they can do, or what they think about their health and their lives. So their feelings, their functioning, as well as their well-being. If we want to obtain pediatric patient-reported outcome assessments, we need to know whether children can self-report. And actually, when I started this work as a postdoctoral fellow and then junior faculty, this was the salient question. There were almost no pediatric patient-reported outcomes that were delivered to children themselves. Generally, if we wanted to know about children, we asked the mothers largely, 85, 90% of the time, sometimes the fathers. But if we ask the mothers or the fathers, we're not getting a person-reported outcome. What we're getting is a proxy assessment. So we're asking that proxy reporter to put themselves into the child's skin. And what you'll see is that there's actually a very little agreement between parents' knowledge of what kids feel and what they can do compared with what kids say they feel and what they can do. We started our work, and this is an older study now, but actually still gets cited quite a lot. We started our work by asking kids using cognitive interviewing methods whether they understood particular concepts. We asked kids all the way from age 5 to age 11 whether they understood items like pain, and what you do is you ask them a question about pain, and then you have them think aloud to describe their response. And that helps you understand whether they're responding about something that they actually comprehend. You might also ask them what they think pain means. So by age 6, the line drops to 0. That means that no kids didn't understand pain. So it's kind of an opposite way of thinking about it. So the y-axis is the percent of kids with poor understanding. You do see that the word irritable is not well understood. So asking a question, for example, in the last 7 days, how often did you feel irritable would not be well understood. Another item that would not be well understood is the word energy. But words like itch, feeling worried, pain, those concepts are actually understood even by very young kids. So this study, and there was much more to it than this, but suffice to say that we tested hundreds of words, health concepts. We learned what kids could understand and what they couldn't understand. It provided what you call content validity for the concepts that we then integrated into a number of different measures. And somewhere over 100, our group now has developed somewhere over 100 different measures for kids as young as age 5 to 25. One of the things that we realized we needed to do with younger kids, particularly kids less than age 8, is to illustrate the concept, because not all kids under age 8 can read, right? So they can understand, they have good receptive understanding. They might not even be able to tell you why they understand, but they can respond in a reliable way to questions that they hear read to them by a computer or illustrated by a character. So one of the things I did when I was an assistant professor is I decided that this first outcome measure that we developed, the Child Health and Illness Profile Child Edition, needed to be illustrated, and we needed a character who we called gender neutral. In fact, I said what I was after was Pat from Saturday Night Live. You never knew whether Pat was a man or a woman. Pat was neither man nor a woman, and always kind of left you guessing. And the cartoonist developed about 200 alternative figures, and this is the one that ultimately was created. We called this character the kid. Boys kind of thought this character was a boy. Girls thought this character was a girl. That was what we were after. We wanted a character that, regardless of what gender the child identified with, they would identify with the kid, and we called the character the kid. When we brought the kid on the road and asked children as young as age 5, 6, or 7, is this child sort of like you? The very first child that we asked this of said, well, no, because she only has 4 fingers. And then the next kid we asked, literally the second kid, is, do you think this kid could be your friend? That child said, yeah, I could like somebody with only 4 fingers. And you know what? Not a single adult on the study team recognized that there were only 4 fingers. This was a cartoon practice. I said to our cartoonist, well, why 4 fingers? He said, to save ink. I said, well, you can spend all the money you need on ink. And ultimately we added the 5th finger and created a pretty cool outcome assessment tool for kids ages 5, 6, and 7, and can be used upwards of kids age 8, 9, 10, and 11. Here's an example of an item from the CHIP Child Edition. How often do you feel really strong? And what we did, in addition to showing the 2 anchors, kid on the left is neutral. The kid on the right is feeling really strong. We also use graduated circles, and this is really intuitive for people who do not read well. So we asked them to put an X into the circle that was about the amount that they felt for each question. So if they never felt really strong, then they would put the X in the never. And we actually learned that kids 5, 6, and 7 tend to use the never, sometimes and always, 1, 3, and 5 most often. And so we thought, well, maybe we'll just collapse the 5 response category item into 3 response categories. And what the kids told us is, no, don't do that. We like having the 5 response categories because it gives us more options. So we ended up with 5. But what we do know, and this is probably true for both kids and adults, is that more than 5 response categories is probably too much for people to handle cognitively. So some of these questionnaires with 9, 10 response categories, it's really a false sense of precision that when you have that many response categories. Here's another one. How often did you feel really worried? So what can kids self-report on and when? So kids ages 0 to 2 are really unable to self-report reliably. You know, most of those kids can't even talk, let alone report. But by age 3, really interestingly, kids can actually respond in a reliable way about certain feelings. They can tell you whether they experience pain. They can tell you whether they feel sad. They can tell you using very easy to understand words and focused on feelings. Kids as young as 3, 4, and 5 can actually give you reliable responses. It does help to use pictures or devices. A device that we used with kids ages 3 in the sickle cell anemia study was a koala bear. I created this koala bear that I think I bought at Toys R Us that had these arms that would wrap around a pole. I got a circular disc, and I put a pole in that circular disc, and I called it green. And I told the kids, this is a tree, and here's Joe or Jane, the koala bear. If you have no pain, put the koala bear at the bottom of the tree. If you have a lot of pain, put the koala bear at the top of the tree. And if you feel pain in between, put it somewhere in the between the bottom and the top of the tree, something along those lines. And what ended up happening is the kids were able to do that, and they moved the koala bear up and down. They'd like to have it, and they would hit the koala bear off, and they would play with the koala bear. But they used the koala bear tree at 3 levels, so we were able to get a 3 response category item, but by asking them the question and having them respond using the koala bear to help them distinguish their level of pain or sadness. By 6 years, there's an emerging capacity for kids to self-report about health, but they can't read. So you need to use audio-assisted administration if you're using a computer, or you need to have an interviewer assist if you are delivering the outcome assessment yourself. Just because kids can't read, this is one of my messages, should not steer you to asking parents, right? I think what it means as child health researchers is to adapt what we do to the kid's developmental status. By age 8, they can respond to questionnaires using developmentally appropriate items. And so virtually all pediatric patient-reported outcomes begin in terms of their self-report at age 8. And by 10 years and older, we've got excellent reliability and validity. So there are a number of ways to develop the number of ways to address the changes in cognitive development when you assess outcomes in children. One of those is to write questions simply. Make sure you don't use more than 10 words. And this goes, by the way, for adults as well, including both your item stem as well as the item itself. Avoid examples. Don't put anything in parentheses. Kids get very concrete. Like, think about that, those 4 fingers, right? So if you say, how often in the past 7 days did you play sports like soccer or hockey, or did you do ballet or something like that? If you give examples, they will respond to the examples. Do not use examples. Write items simply. Don't use examples. And when you've created items, interview the kids to make sure that they understand them. Kids can respond by down to age 6 for about 20 to 25 minutes. Audio interview administered assessments help for all ages, and then pictures are useful for kids below age 8. What about parent proxy assessments? And can you just ask parents? And using that child health and illness profile CE, CHIP CE that I showed you earlier, what we did is we gave it to hundreds of kids and their parents, and we generated from that questionnaire scores for satisfaction, which is really well-being, comfort, which is the word we use for symptoms, resilience, the ability to adapt and to overcome challenges, risk avoidance, which is really risk behaviors, and then academic achievement. And what you see here is the group level differences. So if the bar is above 0, it means the parents in general reported better outcome. If it's below 0, then the kids reported better outcomes. And the units are standard deviation units. So that's the y-axis. So you see, well, for well-being, you get about the same overall level of response, but parents report better outcomes for comfort. That means they report fewer symptoms. I'll say it again. Parents report fewer symptoms than kids report. If you ask a parent, does your kid feeling pain now? They will underreport that in general. If you really want to know how much pain a kid's experiencing, you got to ask the kid themselves. They also, resilience included things like, by the way, family involvement, and parents over report, meaning they provide better outcome assessments for how engaged the children feel in their family, so-called family functioning. Kids feel more disengaged than parents realize. Parents report fewer risk behaviors than kids, but kids say they're doing better in school than parents do. So you actually get different at the group level, different assessments from kids and from parents. And at the individual level, the correlations vary anywhere between about 0.2 to 0.5. So they are not interchangeable. What we recommend is that if you start a longitudinal study with a parent report measure, keep it going. Even when the kids self-report, you can add that, but you're not going to want to switch from parent to child. They're not equatable. Once you start with one, you should keep with that for the duration of the study. Okay, I hope it gives you a feel for some of the complexity and the solutions to that complexity in assessing person-reported outcomes for kids. Now let's talk about PROMIS. PROMIS is a set of tools, a set of item banks that can be turned into questionnaires or into computerized adaptive testing that cross a number of domains. Each one of the bullets on the slide shows you a different measure or measure set that's now available. If you go to healthmeasures.net, all the measures are available there. They're freely available for download. There are measures that we've developed. We developed a number of these for even things like oral health aesthetics, people's satisfaction with how their teeth look. We've got measures of sleep. We have measures of pain, fatigue, emotional distress, depression, anxiety. Our group developed measures of positive affect, life satisfaction, meaning and purpose. We have measures of stress. We have measures of peer relationships, so-called peer functioning, family relationships. And then another study that we did, we created a bunch of school measures. This is a study we call Healthy Pathways to Student Success. And they include things like teacher connectedness, student engagement, academic performance, bullying, and bully victimization. I tend to stay away from questions about school because kids are a lot of times not in school, right? They go to school 180 days a year. So if you say, how excited did you feel in class, a measure of student engagement, or how excited did you feel by the material presented in class? You need to be sure that the kid had a recent experience with school in order to get a response on that. So I tend to stay away from school items. If you are questioning kids who are in school, which we've done a number of school-based studies, then they might and do actually make good sense. And also a lot of kids are homeschooled these days. So just bear that in mind. To understand patient-reported outcomes, you need to understand a few terms. The first is a domain. What is a domain in patient-reported outcomes? This patient-reported outcomes sphere, if you will. Well, it's a feeling, a symptom, or a functioning, peer relationships, family relationships, or perception, things like well-being, that you want to measure. So the domain refers to the concept you want to measure. A domain like peer relationships cuts across different diseases. So in general, domains are not disease specific. They refer to kind of universally experienced attributes that all people can talk about because we all have the lived experience of pain, fatigue, stress, or friendships. Now, Pediatric PROMIS assesses domains that are universally applicable to children, and it includes in the PROMIS suite measures related to their feelings, i.e. symptoms, their doings, i.e. their functioning, and their evaluations of their health and life, i.e. their well-being. So examples of domains that are in the feeling category would be fatigue, pain, anxiety, anger, sadness, happiness. These are all either physically or emotionally experienced symptoms. On the functioning side, motor function, sometimes called physical functioning, sleep functioning, peer relationships, family relationships, and school performance. And then evaluations include things like global health, your overall satisfaction with your health, your evaluation of your life, both overall life satisfaction as well as domain-specific life satisfaction and meaning and purpose. So domains are the concept. PROMIS then uses what's called item banks to create a set of items that are operational measures that are actually the measures of the concept. So an item bank is a collection of items that have undergone psychometric evaluation, and in the case of PROMIS, item response theory calibration, which we won't go into, but if you want to hear more about that, just send me a note. We can jump on the phone. I can tell you about IRT if you like, item response theory calibration. Not all items that we think might measure the concept make it through the standards that we've set for the psychometrics of items or for IRT. But at the end of the day, when you've created an item bank, you have generated a set of items that measure a single domain. So a set of items that say measure fatigue, and each item provides unique information about fatigue, but all the items converge on the concept of fatigue. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about how this works in practice. So think about physical functioning, in other words, mobility, some person's ability to be mobile, their motor function. And you can think about the population of kids sort of like a bell curve in terms of their motor function. Some kids are on the left side bedridden. They can't get up and out of bed at all. Other kids are quite athletic on the right side, and there are kids in the middle. So you can array the population from low to high. Think about the people who are in the middle, sort of in the average, in the middle of that bell curve would have a score of 50, all the way in the bottom closer to 0, all the way in the top closer to 100. And so the population can be arrayed on the 0 to 100 scale. And then you go out and create a set of items that measure mobility, running a mile, riding a bike, which is, by the way, that's a problematic item because not everybody has a bike, right? So you have to be careful when you create these items. Walking more than a block can be a problem for kids. That's another problematic item, right, for kids who live in the country. Walking across the room, standing up on myself, getting out of bed. The trick with item bank calibration is, okay, you've created a bunch of items, you want to, and you know the population is arrayed from 0 to 100, sort of on the bell curve. What you want to do is then figure out where each of these items works best on the scale, right? On the latent variable scale, the population scale. So you calibrate items to either on the low end or to the high end. So for example, if somebody's bedridden, asking them if they could run a mile actually provides you very little information, right? Because they would say no. But asking them if they could get out of bed by myself would provide a lot of information. And so item 1 would be, I could get out of bed myself. Whereas item 9 might be, I could run a mile. You see, the items that provide the most information at a particular point in the population distribution get calibrated to that point. So the secret sauce of item bank calibration is that it arrays the items on the same scale that the population is arrayed. And that allows you to use items in a very efficient way to measure the amount of a latent variable in a population. It also allows you to use computerized adaptive testing. So some of you may have taken the GREs, other standardized tests. Those standardized tests use computerized adaptive testing. They create item banks, just like we've created on the health side. In fact, all of this stuff that I'm talking about in terms of computerized adaptive testing, item banking, was borrowed from educational psychometrics, from all of those investigators who designed the SAT, the GRE, et cetera. They taught us about item banking. Now, the concepts that they measure are things like numeracy or literacy. And what they figured out is that some items work well for kids who have a very high level, it's so-called hard items, very hard level ability. Some items work better for people who have low level ability, so-called easy items. And you may have seen in some of your standardized test reports, easy, moderate, and hard items, how many of each you got right. What computerized adaptive testing does is it takes advantage of that prior slide that we know where the items work best. On this ruler here on the left, the 0 would be, these are, by the way, z-scores. 0 would be the median of the population. And let's pretend for a minute that you give an item about physical functioning, and you can see -3 would be very low physical functioning and high physical functioning. What we want to do is figure out where is a particular kid's level of physical function. So you give you the first item, and according to the response, you can say, all right, that kid has a level of physical function. It's about a standard deviation above the median. But we don't have much precision. So let's give a second item. The second item that the computer chooses is one that works pretty well for people at about 1 standard deviation above the median. And now we know with that, the kid's response, that this score is somewhere around 1.4 to 1.6, maybe 1.42, but we still don't have a lot of precision. There's a lot of error around that. And with each successive item that the computer chooses, you get a higher level of precision. And in this way, you can generate a scale score based on the pattern of items and responses that each individual has provided. And I mentioned this in our discussion on when we talked about testing effects. You can mitigate the possibility of a testing effect by using computerized adaptive testing, because the actual items that get used at any given administration will vary depending on someone's level on the latent variable. Okay, let's talk about some examples. IBD. This is a study that we've done, actually a number of studies on IBD, but I want to talk about a few studies using patient-reported outcomes for IBD. IBD is an immune-mediated disorder of the large and small intestine. Ulcerative colitis influences the large intestine, and the mucosa. Crohn's disease is transluminal, and it can affect the individual anywhere from their mouth to their anus. We know from all the clinical work that's been done in IBD that you can measure GI tract inflammation. That's a common outcome using endoscopy, biomarkers like fecal calprotectin, disease activity indices, as well as growth. Okay, those are clinical measures. But what if we want to measure the impact of new treatments or the impact of the disease itself on people's lived experiences? Well, there we might ask about GI symptoms, pain, fatigue, emotional distress, functioning, and well-being. So one of the things that we do when we start working with a new population of kids with, say, a particular disease is we try to figure out what are the outcomes of most importance. And on the left part of this chart, you're seeing the ranked outcomes from lowest to highest from the parent's perspective. And you're seeing the same outcomes ranked by clinicians. There's actually reasonable agreement between parents and clinicians. And these box plots show you the median, the 25th and 75th percentile, as well as the min and the max. And we're using here a software application called Sawtooth. So higher scores means the outcome is more important to that respondent category. So and these are kids, by the way, these are gastroenterologists and they're parents of kids with inflammatory bowel disease. The number one, let me just go back. The number one outcome from parents' perspective was life satisfaction. Most important, not whether or not they had mucosal healing, whether or not their child had a happy and satisfying life. Number two, do they have pain that's interfering with their functioning? So-called pain interference. Number three, GI symptoms. Number four, their overall satisfaction with their health. Number five, fatigue. Using that methodology, we then created from the PROMIS toolkit a profile of outcome measures that included the highly prioritized outcomes. And so with, 27 items, we were able to create a profile measure that could be completed in 4 minutes that gave you scale scores for 6 different scales. I thought that was pretty cool, and it's something that we've replicated across multiple disease entities. We've given that outcome measure now actually to thousands of kids. Here's a study of 14 GI practices when we gave the outcome measure to over 1,000 kids. We compared their scores to national norms that we have. And so we know what the 95th percentile is. That's the top line here for the US general population of kids. we know what the 75th percentile is for the US general population of kids. So if the kids with inflammatory bowel disease had the same level of, say, pain interference as the general population, the red part of the stack histogram should stop at the 95th percentile. You can see they have a lot more pain interference, right? And the green bar ought to touch the 75th percentile. If you jump over to life satisfaction, you kind of see that there's a little bit less life satisfaction among the kids with IBD, but it doesn't look too different from the general population. But for these other measures, you're seeing somewhat profound differences between what the kids with inflammatory bowel disease say that are experiencing versus the general pediatric population. We also saw for each of these measures that there was a sort of an exposure response relationship with disease activity. We were able to measure disease activity. So people who had sort of quiescent disease are shown in the blue bars, mild disease, red bars, and moderate or severe disease in the green bars. And you can see that step function. This is a slide where I want to just convince you that these measures are actually reliable. And in fact, there's some cool studies that have shown that using these PROMIS measures, you can achieve levels of reliability greater than measures like blood pressure and also some laboratory markers, right? So when we get a value back clinically, we kind of view it as the value, but we don't really ask how reliable is it. So here you're looking on the x-axis. This is sleep disturbance. It's another measure that we developed. You're looking at the T-score. Oops, sorry. And the T-score is similar to that 0 to 100 scale that I showed you a few slides ago when I was talking about item banking. The score of 50 is about the average for the US population. And sleep disturbance is measuring problems with sleep. So you really care about the scores above 40 and above. And what you see for whether you're using all the items in the item bank, the top line, you're only using an 8-item short form, the middle line, or you're using a 4-item short form, is that the reliability of these measures is 0.9 or greater for the vast majority of the scale. So you have what you might call individual level reliability for these PROMIS measures based on the way in which they're developed, which I think is pretty cool. It allows them to be used for individual clinical decision making. It's also important when you use these patient-reported outcome measures to know how much change over time is meaningful. And so here we're showing an approach that we've used, something called the reliable change index, and you can see the equation there to compute the amount of change that you would expect in, say, pain, interference, fatigue, stress, etc., to say, yes, this patient has actually gotten better. The pain has gotten better. So this is called responsiveness. How much change is needed to conclude that the patient's status has truly changed? Finally, I just want to mention a bit about PEPPER. This is an initiative that we led from CHOP with 4 centers of excellence. We were one of the centers of excellence, and when I say lead, I mean we just chaired the steering committee. But you can see it was quite a number of collaborating sites, 82 collaborating sites. And what we did here is we measured, over 5,000 kids across many states in the United States, how a variety of PROMIS measures changed with their condition. And all these papers now are emerging. You can see all the different PROMIS measures there on the left and the different conditions up top. That was the physical condition, physical measures. Here you're looking at mental health and social health measures. So a lot of activity. And one of the beauties of the PROMIS scale is that despite differences in disease status, you can array the scale scores on the same scale. And so what we've done in this slide is showed you using population percentiles, the average score for a variety on the x-axis, which is flipped over, it's over on the left, a variety of health conditions, right? So if cancer survivors had about the same level of fatigue as the US general population, that data point should be right on the 50 because we've converted their scale scores to population percentiles. What you see is that in general, you see more fatigue among kids with chronic conditions than kids who don't have chronic conditions, i.e. the general population. And that there are some conditions like lupus, Crohn's disease, atopic dermatitis, where kids have, on average, a lot more fatigue. And here's the same sort of thing for pain interference. And depressive symptoms, not as great a difference, but lupus is pretty high, right? The median percentile for lupus is at the 70th percentile for the general population. And here's anxiety. So one of the things that is required when you do some of these studies is that you collaborate across institutions. And here, I just want to point out for the work that we did with chronic kidney disease, we collaborated with a number of children's hospital health systems. We collected data over 24 months. We collected both clinical measures as well as patient-reported outcome measures. Here's a number of the patient-reported outcome measures, and look at global health, right? Again, there's that 75th percentile for the general population, the 95th percentile for the general population, the upper bar. And kids with chronic kidney disease report much less satisfaction with their health overall. About the same level of life satisfaction, right? So they're happier with their lives, but they're not happy with their health. A little bit less meaning and purpose, a little less happiness and family relationships. It was about the same. I just wanted to conclude with this idea of the future state for children's health data. So in PEDSnet, we do extract electronic health record data, but I believe that we need to evolve our child health data system to include data from genomics all the way up and through the environment. So I do see a lot of activity towards creating what I like to think of as the child health data system of the future. That includes genomics and biomarkers, measures of body function like pulmonary function testing and biomarkers like fecal calprotectin. Also now linking patients' residents using their latitude and longitude to a variety of area level variables that help characterize their physical and social environments. Things like area level pollution measures, as well as area level socioeconomic status. But we also need to start including, in addition to clinical measures like symptoms and disorders, kids' feelings of their health and well-being, their global health and their subjective well-being. We need to include into the data system assessments of kids' behavior, their academic performance, their preferences for outcome and treatments, and their relationship with families. And so one of the messages here is that the EMR of today is just a starting point. To me, it's like version 1. And to get to version 10 for kids, we're going to require not only digitizing what happens during clinical encounters, but also starting to think about the ecosystems in which kids' health and well-being develop. And that requires a very different way of creating a child health data system. So I'll conclude with my thanks for your attention for this somewhat extensive discussion on patient-reported outcomes. Here you're looking at my bike I spent a lot of time in LA. We have a house in Manhattan Beach. This bike, I'm actually on Palos Verdes right now, overlooking Santa Monica Bay. Off in the distance, you can see Malibu. So again, thank you very much. If you have questions about patient-reported outcomes, bring them to Carol. Carol Tucker and I have worked closely with each other for years. But I'm also happy to talk with you further on anything I discussed today. Thanks very much.